Must have been about midnight. Got a phone call from Darren. All he said was, "Do you want to be with me?" Pack a few things in a bag. Just an overnight bag for you and the kids. He said, "I can't talk, I can't tell you anything. Just do as I ask and it'll be all right."
At first, Sandra Nichols put it down to a series of coincidences. Then after a week or so, she thought she might be going mad. And after that, just for a little while, she was convinced that Darren suspected she was being unfaithful and was having her checked out. It was only after she'd exhausted a host of other possibilities that she reluctantly faced the truth, that the periodically familiar faces, the oddly parked cars with silent occupants, and the men and women talking into the buttons on their collars that she saw on every street corner could mean only one thing: she was being followed by the police. Our relationship was going through an all-time low. Dan was trying his level best to try to keep the fact he was selling cannabis quiet, but his level best was pretty useless. The thing is, he was selling most of it to people that I knew, so it didn't stay quiet for long. When he had gone away over the counterfeit money, I came so close to breaking down. I hated every minute of it. I really didn't think I'd be able to handle it again, and I wanted out. To this day, I don't think Darren knows how close I came to leaving him. I really didn't want him to be arrested, but at the same time, I just knew it would come as a huge relief, because at least then he wouldn't be able to do it anymore. I was saying to him, "Look, we're being watched. I know you're going to be arrested. I know it's going to happen. You're going to go away." He would just tell me to not be silly, that I was just imagining things. I was begging him to stop. "Look, Darren, you're working. You're earning more than enough money to have a pretty good life. You just don't need to do it anymore." But he just didn't want to listen. Mick seemed to have some sort of incredible power over him. Whenever he phoned, Darren would jump. He would be there, dash off to be by his side, no matter what. If he was in the middle of something else, it didn't matter how important it was. He'd drop it to go and see Mick. He'd cancel absolutely anything. If we'd have managed to arrange a babysitter and I'd convinced him to take me out for the night, he'd think nothing of cancelling the whole thing if Mick just called up. And I got really sick of the fact that he'd always promised me that he wasn't doing anything illegal when it was blatantly obvious that he was. In fact, because he was so hopeless at keeping all of his criminal activity from me, I was stunned that he'd never let anything slip about the murder. But he hadn't, not at all. At that time, I had no idea he'd been involved at any level. It was on the news and in the papers all the time. But we only ever talked about it once. It was a couple of days afterwards when the police first announced the names of the dead men. We were watching TV when Pat Tate's picture came up on the screen, and I said, "Hey look, there's the bloke you was in prison with." At first, Darren didn't say anything, he just nodded. And then he said something which has always stuck in my mind. He said that Mick wouldn't be going to the funeral. Then, after that, he never mentioned it again. Steele and Worms had no idea they were being watched, but years of smuggling experience meant that whenever he was on a job, Steele would ensure that everyone practiced basic anti-surveillance techniques. Every roundabout had to be driven around at least twice. Every now and then you should pull over and wait for 20 cars to go past you. So far as the police and customs teams were concerned, Steele's antics were a bit of a pain in the arse, but caused them no real problems. They had now established that the boat had been launched and was on its way to Blankenberg. All they had to do was wait for him to return, and they'd be able to catch Steele red-handed. The only fly in the ointment was that although customs knew the exact methods that Steele used to get the drugs into the country, they had no idea where he actually landed them before heading back out to sea and working on his fishing trip cover story. The speed at which events were now moving had taken the police team by surprise. By the time they called customs in, it was too late for any air support to be brought in to follow the boat. Instead, all that Bill Davidson and his team could do was stake out a few likely landing points. But at 11 p.m, a report came in that the boat was being landed at Brightlingsea Harbour. There were 2 people on board who looked as if they had been fishing. Whenever the drugs landing had been, the team had missed it. "There was a lot of pressure to arrest Steele anyway," said Davidson. "But there was no point. We had no drugs. It was only the most circumstantial evidence of any involvement in smuggling. It would have been the November bust all over again. It might have kept him out of the game for a couple of weeks, but he'd just go right back at it. And the worst thing would be that he'd be aware that he was being watched. We decided to leave it, but make sure we were far better prepared the second time around. Every customs officer has a system. George Stevens had several, but his favourite was to add together all the figures in their day's date, and then count off all the passing cars until he reached that number. So it was just by pure chance on the 14th of April 1996, car number 44, a white Mondeo passing through Dover, at just after 9:45 p.m. got pulled over for a random inspection. A training school, frontline inspectors spent hours learning how to read the subtle affectations of speech and body language that can help indicate that a person is lying. It might be a brief loss of eye contact, a minor shudder in the voice, even an idle hand gesture. Mastering and fine-tuning such a skill can take many years of dedicated service, but as any customs officer will tell you, many of those who pass through make it so obvious they are hiding something that even a trained monkey can tell. As the white Mondeo pulled over to one side, George Stevens walked over to the driver's window and waited for him to wind it down. "Good evening, sir," said Stevens. "Would you mind telling me your name and where you've been?" The driver was a small-time crook hired by Tate's gang at short notice. He was nervous and turned out to be hopeless at hiding it. Sure. My name's Angelikos. Craig Angelikos. I've just come back from Paris. I was over there seeing this bird that I met a couple of weeks ago. Yeah? I see. And is this your car, sir? No. There was a pause. It's hired. A friend of mine hired it. Who was that then? There was another pause. This time slightly longer. The customs officer spoke again. "I need to know the name of your friend who hired the car, sir." Tiny beads of sweat formed on Craig's forehead as he struggled to remember, struggled to stay cool, and then in a flash, the name came to him. Nick Reynolds. It was not the most convincing performance he had hoped for, so was hardly surprised when he was asked to get out of the car so it could be searched. His situation quickly went from bad to worse. The obvious place to start was the glove box, where Stevens found the agreement from Budget Rent-A-Car. "This car's been hired by someone called Sandra Nichols." Angelikos could have kicked himself. "Oh yeah, that's him. That's my friend. Silly me." In the boot, Stevens found a pair of fisherman's waders. They were still damp with seawater and had sand sticking to them. In his hand luggage, Stephen found maps of the Netherlands and Belgium. In his pockets were scraps of paper with names and mobile phone numbers. It was all pretty suspicious, but it was nothing illegal, nothing to warrant an arrest. And he knew it. So having gone through everything once with a fine-tooth comb, Stevens decided to search the car all over again before finally letting the man go, and then running back to the office to run a few names through the computer. Around the 30th of April 1996, Detective Superintendent Ivan Dibley retired after more than 30 years in the police force. The celebrations were only slightly marred by the fact there had been no arrest in the resident case. After all, Dibley knew exactly who had done it and how. As he handed over the investigation to Detective Superintendent Brian Story, the man who had pursued the drug dealers behind the death of Leah Betts, he knew that at the most it was only a couple of weeks before arrests were made. With so much groundwork having been already done, Story's task, though no means easy, was greatly simplified. He organised a mass briefing between the police and customs team to discuss tactics. It didn't take long. It was clear that the boat was the key factor, and a decision was taken to place G&T commercials under 24-hour surveillance. Customs spotter planes were already put on standby, and dozens of undercover officers were earmarked for duty. As soon as the transmissions from their mobile phones showed they were on their way back north, the whole shooting match would swing into action. This time, there would be no mistake.